I will say, here's the distinction I'll make as we enter this next component of the discussion. I am a coach. I've been talking to some people. I coach powerlifting. I coach football. I'm the staff and student wellness coordinator at New Trier High School. I'm involved in a variety of things on the very direct first-person level. But I think the bulk of this conversation will come through my academic preparation. I went to Knox College, and if you know anyone who's looking for the finest liberal arts college in the nation, you might want to take a look at Knox College. After that, I got my first master's degree at Northwestern University, my second at Harvard University, where I studied human development and psychology with a focus on cognitive neuroscience. And in the study of all that, I went away and studied all this and found my way back to the body, to the human system, and that's the filter through which this conversation will happen. So I think what happens oftentimes, and it really does align, we very intentionally structured this day, it aligns with, we talk about long-term athletic development. To me, it often feels like an antidote to the well-intentioned, but I would suggest faulty desire to move a kid forward too fast, to make an all-star team at 9 instead of setting him or her up for a lifetime of success. Okay? I think that metaphor transcends into all areas of life. This is something we've been working on for a long time. It's called the High Order Performance Framework. And the idea within this is that the pinnacle of our human experience, sort of moment by moment, is to be our most high-performing version of ourselves, the most high-performing version of ourselves, to experience life in the ways that we would want. Now, when we go into the athletics realm, the motivations here are usually very clear. It's something along the lines of a championship or success within athletics. We find that this stuff is really fun to talk about. Okay, and if you think about how that transcends to other areas of life, maybe it's professional, maybe it's something within relationships, but the highest, the peak of human experience is fun to talk about and dream about, and they make movies about it and write books about it. And it's important, because it's always important to light the light at the end of the tunnel, but the steps along the way are where a lot of our work focuses. And the idea here would be that to achieve high-order performance outcomes, we have to look at a more holistic view of what a human or what experience looks like. I really do mean it when I say this is one of the most valuable frameworks that we've been able to share with people. I think whether it's on a systems level or on an individual level, there's always something here we can return back to hopefully push in the right direction. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, don't worry about that, but just below high order performance is something that we call the GAP capacities. It's an acronym for Good Athlete Project, but it's also oftentimes what gets us from where we are to where we want to be. That could loosely be categorized as somewhere in the SEL realm. SEL, for those who don't know, social emotional learning, that's where we talk about things like grit and growth mindset and resilience and perseverance and empathy and all those really essential human capacities that take us from, again, where we are to where we want to be. That, too, at least in many of our realms, in the education realm, is sort of fun to talk about. A lot of the conversation is happening in those top 2 tiers. High order performance, what's our big goal, and some of those SEL or what we call GAP capacities. A lot of conversation is happening right there. Our focus, oftentimes, and this is when we go into a team or, like I said, consulting an organization, happens, the bulk of the conversation happens in those bottom tiers. Right? It's language, communication, and relationships that allow us to get into the top tiers. Those are influenced and either enhanced or undercut by what we call the bedrock level, these bedrock physiological concepts. Now, Tony talked about movement, a lot about movement. That's essential. Who's heard of the book Spark? Anyone heard of the book Spark? Okay. And whether it's with long-term outcomes in mind or using exercise as a way to sort of spark cognition, enhance mood, alertness, wakefulness, all those things, it all kind of fits into that realm. Because Tony did such a nice job in his presentation, I think I'm going to focus on these other 2 on the bedrock level for today's conversation. Who's heard of growth mindset? Is it fairly, okay. And for those who haven't, it basically looks like this. Carol Dweck is a pioneering researcher on this. She was very kind to donate some of her time when we were developing in the early stages of the Good Athlete Project. Her book has become fairly famous, and her concepts it's almost like a cliche in education, how frequently they're used. But what matters is is the actual science behind it. And probably the most important study, or the seminal study that kickstarted a lot of her work, was within a math class. So I'm not going to get the facts exactly right, but I hope the concept will hold here. So there are these students, these young students, in a math class. And in that early study, they divided these young students into two groups. Call them Group A, Group B. In Group A, now, important to note actually, these are pretty high-achieving young students. Okay? So in Group A, these high-achieving young students are being praised on their ability routinely. They'll get an A on a test. Fantastic job. You're so talented. You're so smart. You're so good at math. You did it again. Nice job. Group B, in the same situations, they'll get an A on a test, and they are praised for their effort and for their approach. They'll say, congratulations, nice job. You must have worked really hard on this. Okay, you must have taken advantage of the other study opportunities that were out there, et cetera, et cetera. They're praised on the process. Okay, so you might be able to see where this is going, but down the road in this experiment, they were given essentially an unpassable test. So they're doing poorly for the first time in their academic careers, and all they did very simply was follow and listen and watch Group A and Group B after this intentional barrier was thrown out there. And what they found was in Group B, obviously enough, they started asking questions like, remember that was the process group, where did I go wrong in my process? The internal dialogue is moving in the direction of, well, maybe I shouldn't have watched The Simpsons, or I don't know which TV shows are even popular. Maybe I shouldn't have watched so much Netflix. You know what I mean? What they start to reflect on their own process. Where did I go wrong? Okay, and how can I build better in the future? Whereas Group A, who was praised for talent, what happened was self-doubt started to creep in. They started to say things internally and to their teachers, well, maybe I'm not as smart as everyone said I was. Maybe math wasn't my thing in the ways that I was told. And worse still, if we recognize, and in the understanding of this whole discussion, the mentors we mean to be, they start to question the mentors. Right? Maybe they were wrong. Okay, and then you can see how that's sort of a negative ripple effect. So where this can be an incredibly, incredibly valuable tool in personal practice, whether it's self-talk in our own minds or something that we give to people, it's really clear that it's reliant on language. Okay, and I hope that that's a good example of this idea where these gap capacities put growth mindset within those gap capacities to have insufficient language, to not be able to call upon the language in order to frame setbacks, in order to frame your own experience. Like, the whole thing breaks down if you don't have the language it takes to get there. Does that make sense? So inherent in this idea of growth mindset, like it's essential to this concept, you must have the ability and the language to name setbacks, to cultivate a certain sort of self-talk, and to identify where you want to go and how you are going to essentially get there. The reason I bring all this up is if you undercut that capacity with, look at the opposite of malnutrition, a sedentary lifestyle, and lack of rest, not sleeping, the ability to access that language is degraded significantly. Okay, so I wonder if there's some sort of hidden, maybe even systematic concerns within all of this. Are we trying to get students to the next level of themselves? If so, could we call upon well-researched ideas like growth mindset? If so, let's teach the language to build for that outcome, and then look all the way back and say, okay, well, if that kid is on 3 hours of sleep and fueled by Cheetos and Mountain Dew, maybe we're fighting a battle that we've made far more difficult than it ought to be. And that would look different case by case, situation by situation. In some realms, it's a matter of access. Right? This is legitimate, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but there are some areas where sleep depression is almost an absolute because of crowded households or because you're sleeping on a couch or whatever it might be, where your primary nutrition is coming. Chicago is one of the biggest food deserts in the world, or in the U.S. at least. A lot of people do their grocery shopping at gas stations, and that's not an anecdote. That's real. Okay, so are we unintentionally, due to an access issue, making the stage more difficult for ourselves? Anyway, I almost got heated right there. I almost kicked it up a notch, and I didn't. I pulled back, but okay. So how do what we try to do is look at things through three lenses. Understanding, motivation, and access. I just mentioned an access concern that probably site by site would have to be considered. In terms of understanding and motivation, understanding is for us, okay, for the professionals on days like today to really take big steps in our own understanding so that we can distribute it. Motivation, we found that athletics is the perfect place to help motivate athletes because the goals are so clear. If you work with athletes, here's something that you might want to give to them. We know that the positive ripple effect of what I'm about to say is vast, but performance only, here it is. We tracked a group of swimmers over the course of a season. I'd actually be really curious to hear what your swim schedule was like back in the day. Swimmers are notorious for just working and grinding, getting up early because of the low resistance of the water, the low impact of water-based training. They train all the freaking time. It's hard. We tracked a group of swimmers over the course of a season, and we asked them a series of questions for at the beginning of every dry land training session, so whenever they were in the weight room. And we asked a few things to kind of hide what we were looking for, but what we were really looking for was sleep pattern. Okay, so how well did they sleep? We looked at quantity and quality. And what we found was perhaps, based on the science, not especially surprising, but it was more dramatic than we anticipated. What we found was that swimmers who slept fewer than 6.5 hours on average were 4 times more likely to finish on the bottom half of the team in terms of performance improvement. That's sort of a long sentence. Let me explain, because it's an important one. 4 times more likely to be on the bottom half of the team in terms of improvement. Now, the interesting part here to me is that does not mean that they didn't perform in spite of that sleep deprivation. And I think that's why this is sort of an underlying kind of a scary, insidious idea in the structures of our systems the way we have them, is because they're on the podium, right? They got 3rd place in a meet. They're coming home with medals. They're getting applauded. And the feedback they're getting from their performance is still fairly high. They're just not getting a lot better, at least compared to their peers who are resting well. So training similarly, but the ones who weren't resting very well, we're not getting. Anyway, we also, psychologically started to tap into this idea that we call the talent delusion, right? So you are good enough to perform in spite of your own degraded state, right? That's what we call a talent delusion. I think a lot of people who work in schools in this area, of course, can probably recognize that happens every so often, in spite of yourself. And if our goal is self-optimization, and if our goal as coaches is to set people on a healthy path for their lifetimes, then we got to make sure that we call it like we see it, or call it like it actually is pretty early on. Because what you don't want is a lifetime of sleep deprivation. The science behind that is terrifying. Okay, you're talking about cardiovascular disease. You're talking about higher risk of obesity and diabetes, like all cognitive dysfunction. It really is it can be a mess if you do it poorly. I think we should do it better. Anyway, this is sort of for us to chew on, because we see this in the professional realm a lot. There's a lab out at UC Berkeley run by a guy named Matthew Walker. If you haven't explored that research, I highly advise it. What they essentially were tracking was, how does sleep loss affect cognition? Okay, so the first group, the first control-ish group was, not a control, but first group was an all-nighter, recognizing that people do pull all-nighters, whether there are social reasons for that, or I think probably in the group that we're more interested in this interest of self-enhancement, pull an all-nighter for finals or whatever it may be. So opting into an all-nighter. Well, what does that do? One night of no sleep, say cramming for a test, showed 400% increase on errors and missed responses in cognitive testing the next day. So if anyone, parents, whatever, if you want to give add an important narrative and layer to your student's desire to pull an all-nighter, this might be important, okay? And what happens, because we actually get pushback when we talk to student groups about this, we get pushback. They're like, well, it works for me. And we don't judge. If it works for you, great. I don't think it works as well as you think it does, okay? And you're probably better off planning ahead instead of cramming the night before, because here's what actually happens. You might input a lot, but the neuroscience literature would say decisively that you just can't access what you just input. That's the issue. So you could stay up all night inputting. Your attention is probably going to falter, so you're not inputting quite as much as you thought, first of all. And then maybe most importantly, the next day when you have to take the test, you just can't pull at the information that you thought you were inputting. The file drawer is locked because of sleep deprivation. Because when your body is setting off alarms that it's in a really bad state, U.S. history is like not very important on that hierarchy. So anyway, increased 400%. That's the punchline here. But then they kept going, and they were toying with what is the threshold. 4 hours of sleep for 6 nights. My sister just had a child recently. She and her husband, I think, know what this looks like. 4 hours of sleep for 6 nights. Doesn't seem quite as bad as an all-nighter, but the errors were the same. Another 400% increase in errors in concentration and misresponses on this cognitive testing. 4 hours for 11 nights. That was like pulling back-to-back all-nighters. This is real stuff. So 4 hours of sleep for not even 2 weeks, like back-to-back all-nighters. Now, this is the one, when we go into organizations, I don't know what time you get here in the morning, Tommy. I bet it's early, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but we go into similar places, and they will say, well, they got their early bird class. They got to be, they're up at 4:30 because the first group's coming in at 5:30, whatever it might be, to get to work. 6 hours of sleep for 10 consecutive nights, okay? I'm telling you, we go into places where people say, well, that sounds good. That sounds optimistic. If I get 6 for 10 in a row, I'm doing something right. 6 hours of sleep for 10 consecutive nights, the same 400% rise in errors and lapses in concentration. Now, the interesting component to all of this is, here's a quote, participants consistently underestimated the degree of performance disability. Think about that. It goes back to that idea that we call the talent delusion. And the idea behind this is pretty straightforward. In fact, I might sort of source the crowd. Has anyone pulled an all-nighter or something like it before? Okay. How did you feel the next day? And I'm looking for actual terms. Garbage. Like garbage was one. Jittery. What I hear back here? What is it? Like trash, garbage, same family. If I was on the whiteboard, I'd put them in the same column. Trash, garbage. We get nauseous. We get foggy, find it irritable, all those kinds of things. Now, when the body is essentially telling you after a night of sleep deprivation, because that's a very real threat to life. I don't know if people recognize that. We've got this sort of machismo around sleep these days. Like I can go to work on 4 hours of sleep and be fine. Okay. If you don't sleep for long enough, you will die. And that's just true. If you go long enough without sleep, you will die. Period. In fact, this is sometimes a compelling narrative you can give to your kids. The Guinness Book of World Records they track everything. They will allow records. You can attempt to juggle chainsaws. You can walk a tightrope over any sort of chasm or set of buildings, whatever. They'll do anything. But they will no longer recognize sleep deprivation records. Because in theory, you could be good at juggling chainsaws. But in actuality, if you go long enough without sleep, you will die. And they don't want to be on the hook for that if people pass away trying to do that. Anyway, it's incredibly compelling literature, whatever. The reason that this is happening, I think, is because 6 hours is enough to not set off the same sort of alarm bells that 0 hours does, if that makes sense. You're not throwing your body into a tailspin quite in the same way. You can survive on it. Same idea, you just won't be as good. And it's really interesting to think about, like I said, I work at a big public school, 4,000 people, hundreds on staff and faculty. And if you could say somehow that we could eliminate, to say you moved it in the opposite direction, move cognitive ability 400% in the positive direction by doing something that was free, would you accept it? And they would say yes. But then if you say, okay, fine, let's just move school start time back to 8:45, they'll say no as quickly. It's pretty amazing stuff, which brings us always back to that idea of, does your behavior match your goal? Anyway, we did it another year, and this has become a really resonant idea in my life, in the life of many people who I care for and love, and that includes, I guess, the students that I work with. Stress is huge. Now, a couple things. Number one, the reason we're here as a human species is because of stress. Stress is good, okay, to a degree. Everything is within a threshold. If you want to get better at running, you have to run. You have to stress the systems of the body, your cardio, enough to force growth, and then you get better at running. You can't think about running and get better at running. You have to run. You have to stress the systems. You have to throw homeostasis off enough to generate a response. So that's the first thing. I think we could look at stress a little differently. The second one, though, which is the one that we always talk about when we talk about stress, is this sort of chronic stress. The one that's forced by, I would call, prediction error, or constantly being in this slow, simmering, hot state of, what are people thinking about me? It's the social media concern, sort of in a nutshell, but it's a different kind of stress. Now, here's an interesting link. The next year that we tracked this stuff, what we found similar enough performance enhancements or degradation through sleep, but what we found maybe more interestingly was a sleep quantity and perceived quality of stress relationship. And if you think about that, if stress quantity didn't necessarily go up. All of our kids were under similar amounts of stress, whether it's academic, it's social, it's athletic, it's all these things you're involved in. But the way that they perceived the quality of those stressors on a scale of positive to negative, it was far worse when they hadn't slept, which might be obvious enough. Think about it from our perspectives. If you were about to jump into traffic, and I'm thinking about my own morning commute, if I'm about to jump into traffic and I'm well rested, then what I usually do is I just get a cup of coffee and put on a podcast and I go to work. And if I do that, if I engage with that same obstacle, it being traffic, and I've only slept for 4 or 5 hours because of a certain situation, the way I engage in that 45-minute morning commute is far different. And that is transferring to our kids as well. Okay, and it's not just traffic. It's a complicated lunchroom. It's all sorts of adolescent relationships that can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but that's something that we have to be giving our kids. I think we talk about methods of dealing with stress a lot. I think we need to be talking about habits of life that influence our ability to manage stress as often.